Podium mic it is. How about now? All right, great. Good evening and welcome to the Clapp Auditorium at the Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole. Is this the first time in this auditorium for anybody tonight? Great, welcome. Thanks for making the trip over. We're happy to have everyone from the community, newcomers and regulars. Thank you to the audience that's here tonight, and also remotely, we have some zooming in from outside, so we have some remote viewers too, and that's part of my job here tonight, is to let you know that this event is being live streamed and also recorded. We'll have some time for questions at the end. And also to please silence your cell phones, make sure they won't cause any interruptions during the presentation tonight. I'd like to also extend a welcome to the Falmouth Forum Committee for putting this great series together. The committee is responsible for coming up with ideas and contacting speakers and getting them to come in to engage with us. And we're always looking for a balance of science and history and culture. If you have ideas for people who you think would kind of fit that, something that would interest a wide variety of the community, we're always interested in your suggestions. It's usually a connection, a friend, somebody you heard speak and you think they'd have something compelling to share, so that's fun. And so thank you to the committee and to everybody for coming tonight. And without further ado, I will hand this off to Tucker Clark. She's a member of our committee and she is going to introduce tonight's speaker. Thanks, Tucker.
Greg Watson is an optimist. He's Director of Policy and Systems Design at the Schumacher Center for New Economics, currently focusing on community food systems and ways to connect and expand those and other local and global systems to achieve a just and sustainable world. Greg came to Falmouth 42 years ago to work as a director at the New Alchemy Institute. There, he learned that his particular strength was in bringing people together to solve problems, often by challenging conventional wisdom or established procedures. He later used that strength working for the Commonwealth. He was the first executive director of the Massachusetts Renewable Energy Trust and was executive director of the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, one of the nation's first urban agriculture programs. He served as Massachusetts Commissioner of Agriculture under 3 governors. And actually there's a lot more, but what Greg would like to be is most proud of is his grandchildren. And that is why he does the work that he does. His experience and worldview make his optimism as contagious as his enthusiasm. Please welcome Greg Watson.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. And remember, an optimist, for me, optimism stems from knowing that we have options. Doesn't necessarily say we're going to be able to exercise them. We'll talk about daring to be naive. I became an environmentalist for 2 major reasons. One, I lived on the banks of the Cuyahoga River, which was made infamous by Randy Newman as a river that would occasionally catch fire, and on the banks of Lake Erie, 2 of the most polluted bodies of water in the United States. So it was obvious to me that even I lived in the city, environmental issues were critical, and I decided to become committed to the environmental movement as early as the 1960s, 1967. That came at a cost in terms of trying to understand how to reconcile environmental quality with economic equality. And I was actually called on the carpet by my colleagues, African-American colleagues at Tufts University, when I told them of my interest and commitment to the environmental movement. And they really felt that the goals, at least espoused by the environmental community, were not only, and this would really stung, irrelevant to the causes of Black Americans, but actually sinister. And they said, what do you mean? He said, well, listen, no growth, limited growth. How do we ever achieve any measure of economic equality under that scenario? And I had an intuitive feeling that the two goals were compatible, but I didn't have an intellectual response. Nothing in my formal education gave me a clue as to how to deal with those, so I did what a lot of us did back then. I went underground. And I discovered the Whole Earth Catalog and the writings of Stuart Brand, discovered the New Alchemy Institute, a number of organizations that had a different way of looking at the world, a different way of interpreting the world, and one that resonated with me more so than the one that I saw every night on the nightly news or read in the New York Times. And the person, my sort of virtual guru at that point, or mentor, became Buckminster Fuller. And I'm going to use this to talk about sort of the frame what I want to talk about for the rest of the evening. And his goal is to make the world work for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation without ecological offense or the disadvantage of anyone. So dare to be naive, right? There you go, right there. So what captured me was this term, spontaneous cooperation. Bucky wasn't known for throwing away words. As a matter of fact, he was very precise in his language. In many cases, if you've ever read him, know that he'll make up words if he doesn't feel the right ones are available for him to sort of get his point across. So this idea of spontaneous cooperation, it's different from, let's just say, obviously forced cooperation, or even mandated cooperation, or even incentivized cooperation. Spontaneous cooperation is voluntary. And I started to think about the programs and projects that I've been involved with that had some measure of spontaneous cooperation. It's about organizing and bringing people together. And I'm looking at the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, my work with farmers markets, the dairy industry, and most recently, renewable energy and climate change, particularly around Buckminster Fuller's concept of developing a global electric grid, interconnected global grid. So I would say probably most of these are still sort of very operative. How to ignite spontaneous cooperation? You need two things for me, at least from my experience: a clearly defined problem and then actionable solutions. The ones that I sort of operated on initially, especially with agriculture, came when a study was commissioned by Commissioner Fred Winthrop, Commissioner of Agriculture, back in the 1970s, undertaken by Harvard Business School, Ray Goldberg. Massachusetts was losing farms at an alarming rate back then. Beginning at the end of the Second World War to the mid-70s, we were on track for losing about 200 farm businesses a year and 10 to 20,000 acres of farmland. Commissioner Winthrop said, what can we do to address this hemorrhaging of our agricultural economy? And Ray Goldberg and his team put together a study, and then they came up with a very brief policy for food and agriculture in Massachusetts, 22 pages. They highlighted about a number of things, but one was the state purchase of development rights. You need to preserve the agricultural land base. And the purchase of land rights said, the state has paid over $100 million over the years to pay farmers the difference between its the development value of the farm and its agricultural value. It's cash for the farmer, allowing them to do what they need to do to enhance their ability to farm, but in exchange, they've given up their right for that to be developed. So it preserves that land and agriculture. Taxing farmland based on its agricultural value instead of its development value, and support direct marketing to benefit both farmers and consumers. And this was done, again, the Blue Ribbon Commission led by Ray Goldberg. And in Massachusetts, this inspired an incredible movement in terms of looking at our food situation. At that time, very few people realized how dependent on out-of-state sources of food Massachusetts is. And we still are dependent upon 75 to 80% of our food coming from out-of-state, as far away as California or in other parts of the world. We saw that in Massachusetts, the movement to revitalize and reestablish our agricultural economy was led by a gentleman by the name of Mel King, who was a black legislator from the South End. And Mel did more than any other legislator during the sort of 60s and 70s on behalf of agriculture in the Commonwealth. He was actually asked at one point by one of his colleagues, looking at him and obviously sort of suggesting, well, Mel, you're an urban African-American. Why are you so interested in agriculture? And Mel's response was, because I eat. There is a network and a vibrant network of what I will call, again, sort of the spontaneous cooperation. The group here on the left of the screen is called the Boston Urban Gardeners. It was a real network and actually a community that really worked to bring access to agriculture or gardening land to folks in the city. Most of when we talk about sort of bridging that gap between economic equality and environmental equality, and especially lifting people out of poverty, starts with land. Land, whether it's a farming, for housing, or for businesses, you have to have land. And in farming, 98% of the farmland in America is owned by whites. And that's just a matter of fact. And some of that dating back to times when land was taken away from folks of color. But BUG was this incredible network that would take any means necessary to restore agriculture or farmland, restore the gardening resources in the city of Boston. And they would even go so far as, again, in the case here on the right, where they were able to recruit the U.S. Army 64 2nd Battalion to move tons of topsoil from Worcester to the Boston Gardeners. Now, this is sort of interesting. You probably couldn't do that today and get away with it because we would be, like, obviously the press would be all over that. So part of understanding what options you have and the tools that are available to you really you have to understand where you are culturally and politically. That was acceptable then, probably not acceptable now. You can probably, one of the people that was instrumental, Charlotte Kahn, the woman in the center, was the organizer of BUG, and she's down here. And you can see certainly folks from the 42nd Battalion, but that's also Lieutenant Governor John Kerry, whom she recruited, knowing that if I get him on board, I may be able to bring these resources to Boston. Getting the direct marketing options and establishing more direct connections between farmers and consumers was a big part of the process of revitalizing agriculture. We take farmers markets for granted now. Back in 1970, 1978, we had no urban farmers markets in Massachusetts. Farmers understood the benefits of direct marketing, weren't too happy about coming into dangerous cities to sell their produce, even though they realized that there was a huge market for them there. So one of my first consulting jobs as a young man was to organize the Boston farmers markets. And we saw there that, again, sort of another example, or an example, I think, of the spontaneous cooperation. Our first market opened on July 8th, 1978. We had commitments from 20 growers to come to Dorchester, Fields Corner, to open up our farmers market season. Market opened at 9 o'clock. At 8:30, no farmer. 8:45, not a single farmer there. We had Commissioner of Agriculture, we had Lieutenant Governor, we had 3 TV stations, we had the Boston Herald American and the Boston Globe, and no farmers. And all of a sudden, around 9 o'clock, right before 9 o'clock, Cacciador Barbarian, his wife Mary, and his daughter Ellen come trucking down Dorchester Avenue, and they didn't have time to unload their trucks. They were mobbed by this horde of consumers who just overwhelmed them. And the reason we found out that they were the only farmers to come, well, the farmers were afraid to come into the city. They pledged they would come, but they're afraid. Now, this was 1978, and we were in the midst of court-ordered busing for desegregation in Boston. There was just a lot of tension, racial tension in the city. But when Ketchy's buddies saw him on TV that night, the TV cameras were very kind. They didn't take a wide-angle look and show one truck in the middle of Dorchester Avenue. They saw one truck in hands grabbing the food before he could even get it off the truck. The next week, we got our 20 farmers. So it was sort of this incredible sort of way, not incredible, but a way of starting to change the system. We realized this was a way for consumers and farmers not to just set up transactional relationships, but to create a new system, more direct marketing system, and that shouldn't just be in one city. We really needed to expand this and give folks an option. As Fuller would say, never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the old model obsolete. And it may not make it totally obsolete, but at least it provides another option. And that's what direct marketing and farmers markets do, as folks know, there are trade-offs. Some more time that you have to, that's involved and traveling, but nonetheless, we can do that. Now, Bucky called this comprehensive anticipatory design, and is sort of a way of designing systems that really allow us to do more with less. And the place where I really learned what that means was the New Alchemy Institute. How many people here familiar? I hope most of you are from here, at least had a chance, yes. So New Alchemy was a place where it was a think, do tank, where the future was being created. The future, at least the future that I envisioned when I was looking for those alternatives and ways of reconciling equality and economic equality and environmental equality. To restore the lands, protect the seas, and inform their stewards, meeting basic human needs, using nature as a model for design. And again, scientists, engineers, artists, activists, poets, a real eclectic group that I had the pleasure of joining and working with for a total of 4 years, 3, and then another short stint before moving on. But interesting, here's again, Bucky's geodesic dome. It encompasses a lot of principles, won't go into them now, but clearly, he saw the dome, if not the way to deal with this issue of how to provide folks with adequate, affordable shelter. What he wanted to demonstrate with the dome was a way that you can encompass maximum volume using the least amount of material to do it, if when you work on, obviously operating in a world with limited resources, but that's also very strong and at lightweight. I think it took 21 people to pick this thing up and move it across the New Alchemy site, but it could withstand near hurricane force winds. Bucky himself came to visit and was really impressed by the fact that not only had we constructed the dome, but that we filled it with biological and living systems. And that's Nancy Jack Todd, Liz Fayal, Jay Baldwin, and John Todd with him there. I mentioned Mel King. He was my mentor. I thought he might be a little disappointed when I left the city of Boston and Boston Urban Gardeners to come to Cape Cod and work at the New Alchemy Institute. It was just the opposite. I think of my 4th week there, he brought a group of his students he taught at MIT, and he taught a group, community fellows, and they were people of color with going through career changes and wanted to know what their options were. And the first place he brought this group of students was to the New Alchemy Institute. I said, Mel, what? And I was pleased, and I said, why New Alchemy? And he said to me, I just want them to see what's possible. I want them to see the things that they never even considered that they could do is there, because that empowers them to think broader. It dares them to be naive. These are just shots of the Cape Cod Arc, and this system that, among others, Ron Zweig is in the audience and others developed, sort of captures this notion of a closed system where you've got the tanks of water that are used not only to provide habitat for sources of protein, tilapia, but they're a source of heat storage for the dome itself, as you saw before. Obviously, the water becomes fouled if you don't do something sooner or later with the fish waste, but then you realize if we can just connect that to a system that could use the fish waste, we know it's no longer fish waste, it's resource-rich water. It's a resource, a valuable resource, circulated through the plant systems supported in vermiculite that actually then double as sort of filters that allow us to recirculate the water back into the tanks. And it's an elegant, beautiful system, simple, beautiful, and then you realize that, yeah, that's the way, at least that's the way we think that nature works, right? The byproducts of one system serve as the inputs of another. Can we start to mimic that in the systems that we design? Industrial ecology, call it what you want to, but as Bucky once said, pollution is a valuable resource in the wrong place. My work at New Alchemy was not as a researcher, wasn't a scientist, but it was the first time they brought on an organizer, which is what I am. I'm an organizer. And the idea was, how do you get these ideas, these concepts, these artifacts into the hands of people who can really use them? Once again, going back to that notion, can we start to provide the tools that allow people, and particularly, I will say low income, but not exclusively, people to gain some measure of control over meeting their basic needs? Can you do it? And food, energy, shelter, how much of that can I have some control over and become empowered. So people were shocked. And I guess after 3 years, I left New Alchemy and to go to, of all places, state government. Not just state government, but the Executive Office of Economic Affairs. And for me, it was important because I spent 3 years there and I saw what worked. And it was a source of cautious optimism. That optimism was, we have options, but not if they stay on 12 acres in Hatchville. How do we start to get this out? And can systems thinking inform political solutions? And so that was it's very interesting. The Centers of Excellence was a program that was developed to try to encourage partnerships between industry, academia, and government to promote economic development based on the research that was going on in our public institutions of higher education, the UMass system. So we're looking at polymer sciences, we're looking at biotechnology, we're looking at photovoltaic panels, we're looking at marine electronics. Do they have civilian and domestic applications that will allow Massachusetts to remain in the forefront? Sort of that whole idea of Route 128, sort of people think was sort of an organic sort of creation around MIT, but could we mimic that? And it sort of came during the time that, and by the way, it came at the time that Mike Dukakis was running for president, and the criticism he got for this is, you can well imagine, it was viewed as industrial policy, picking winners and losers. And so the program, I won't say it didn't die, but it also didn't prosper the way that we had hoped it would. But perhaps for me, the most important part of being in that office of economic affairs in that time was I was able to create something called the Massachusetts Office of Science and Technology. We called it MOST, and it was you're looking at the first and only executive director of the Massachusetts Office of Science and Technology. But one of the things that we were able to do, and this was in 1989, we issued a document called Sustainability, and its first issue was dedicated to climate change. And I actually ran it, and we got a Massachusetts State House Forum on climate change that was convened by Secretary of State Mike Connolly, who I ran into at an auto repair shop here in Falmouth a couple of weeks ago, and we reminisced about this. I'm not kidding you, and chaired by Secretary of State Joe Alviani. A couple of years later, I was sworn in as Commissioner of Agriculture. The outgoing commissioner, this guy on the right here, Gus Schumacher, had to return to the World Bank where he had been on loan. And you see that guy once again there? It's like Forrest Gump there. That's Mel King. Mel King was involved in so much that went on. So this picture, I got sworn in. Before Gus was the person who recommended me to Mike Dukakis. They said, I think this guy, Greg Watson, should replace me because we met at the farmers markets. Going back to the farmers market, he loved the farmers markets. He loved the way they were run. And he said, this is the guy that replaced me. Mike Dukakis calls me up and says, Greg, I have Gus Schumacher call me with this cockamamie idea. He said, I should hire this black kid from Cleveland, Ohio, working at the New Alchemy Institute to become Commissioner of Agriculture. And I said, only in Massachusetts could that happen. Talked about the farmers market in terms of sort of providing farmers with a way of supplementing and boosting their marketability and as part of the revitalization process. This caught me by surprise. When I got sworn in, I was thinking I was going to do more of that, more of transferring the concepts that we had developed at New Alchemy, like integrated pest management, organic agriculture, which is one of the reasons the Farm Bureau and others said, we want you to come on because we do need to improve our relationships with the environmental movement. And that was really clear to farmers at that time. Can you help us do that? So we did a lot of that work, but I became very concerned with what was going on with the dairy industry, because the dairy industry is a backbone of most agricultural economies. One, in terms of the land, most land, the majority, a vast amount of agricultural land in Massachusetts and most states is occupied by dairy farms. But they also support the infrastructure, the large machinery, the supply chain. Without a dairy industry, you find that you have to search farther and farther away. This is from recollection. I got, after becoming sworn in as commissioner, it was very clear that I only had a short period of time to be there because Dukakis's term was going to end in about a half a year. And the dairy farmers, a group of dairy farmers, Mass Dairy Farmers Association, called me out to some remote farm in London, and said they wanted to talk to me about their plight. And I approached them. The first thing they asked me was, Commissioner, what do you know about dairy? Thought about this for a second. Said, okay, I have a very quick answer. Nothing. And I thought there was going to be either just sort of, people would just roll their eyes, or perhaps it's time to end this conversation, but they smiled. And one of them, Gordy Cook, looked at me and said, that's great. Will you listen? We have a problem, and the problem is serious, but we also have a solution. We've not had a commissioner that would listen to what it is that we need to do. And I'm going to be very quick with this because as you may or may not know, dairy farmers have no control over the price they charge for their milk. It's all through something called the Federal Milk Marketing Order. An arcane system was set up many years ago in order to try to create a graduated pricing system that got milk from what back in those days was the place where most of the milk was produced, like in the Midwest, in Minnesota, Wisconsin, but gradually got it to the consumer and the population loads on the coast. But they had to come up with a system of pricing that had nothing to do, as it turns out, nothing to do with the cost of production of milk in Massachusetts. Dairy farmers were getting up every morning realizing, I'm not going to make any money and I have no control over doing it. They devised an incredible scheme that would allow them to guarantee them a break-even point based on their cost of production, the money that it would come from the dairy processors. Just so you'll know, that's the Westlands, the Gorelick Farms, the people, once again, the middle people that we try to eliminate with the farmers markets who make most of the money at the expense of the farmer and the consumer. Now, you can't get rid of the dairy processors, right? Because you got to process it. But they were raking in a lot of money as the dairy farmers were going out of business. We came up with a way that they would pay into a fund that did nothing more. Now, I'm not going to take time to explain it all, but make sure that the dairy farmers would break even when the federal price of milk fell below their cost of production. And we got their testimonies of what their cost of production was through a series of hearings throughout the state that I had. Well, we won't get into that. But at any rate, it worked. We had, and it made it through challenges through all the Massachusetts lower courts, and even the Massachusetts Supreme Court. We were challenged from states like Vermont and New York because we were charging a fee based on all milk sold in Massachusetts. That included Vermont milk, it included New York milk, but the benefits only went to Massachusetts farmers. I spent a lot of time with Howard Dean and other folks in other states who are trying to say, how come we can't benefit from this? And I would say that only if I become commissioner of New England, that would be the only way that could work. But the Gorelick Farms did succeed in getting the US Supreme Court to take this on. And we lost. We lost 7-2 in the Supreme Court, which in many cases would be devastating, and it was devastating to the farmers. But here's the point. Even though they lost, one of the things they realized was they did everything they could. They took it all the way to the US Supreme Court. They had an idea. There were no other solutions out there on the board, and they dared to be naive that they could restructure the milk marketing order and the way milk is priced. I am sort of sad to say that right now, when we started this, there are about 400 dairy farms in Massachusetts. So Vermont's got thousands, but right now Massachusetts has about 110 dairy farms left. And it's sort of on that inevitable track where we probably won't see dairy as a major part of our agricultural economy in the near future. As a matter of fact, the processors would be just as satisfied. And do you know what the largest dairy producing state in the country is now? California. Not Minnesota, not Wisconsin. Huge dairy farms, lots of manure problems. And at some point, as came out in the testimony during our hearings, Massachusetts, the trucks that come from California will probably be filled with powder and will be reconstituted in New England, and that will probably be our milk. On to the city, real quick. Bioshelters, ocean arts, city farming, a title of a book by John and Nancy Todd. I spent a number of years at the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. I was right out of agriculture. As a matter of fact, I was asked to apply for the job of executive director, primarily because the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, community of poor white, Black, Latino, Cape Verdean residents I'll tell you why they're poor in just a minute, but right in the heart of Boston, we're looking and working on how to revitalize their community. It was one of the poorest communities in Boston. It suffered from white flight, that was in part sort of fueled by the GI Bill. The GI Bill, by the way, after the war, even if you served in the war, most African Americans could not take advantage of the GI Bill. So they were left behind, even as others sort of made their way into the suburbs, and not just the suburbs, but home ownership. And that was sort of one of the things that in the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative was this community that came together. Now, here's a median net worth of non-immigrant African-American households in Boston area, $8. $8. And that's compared to $247,500 net worth for white households in the Boston area. And this was a Boston Globe series that was done back in 2017. There is no wealth building. I mean, and so what do we do? And once again, this is why this whole notion of how much attention we can provide to, or divide our attention and resources when we're thinking about environmental quality and economic equality has really got to be considered. This community pulled itself together. They were organized. They had visioning processes. They had community meetings. I was executive director for 3 years. We had 30-member board of directors, representing each one of the ethnic communities there, businesses, community development corporations, and we met the first Wednesday of every month, 30 members. And never did we have a problem with a quorum. The idea was how to regain the land in the community. This is what the community looked like as a result of redlining, disinvestment, neglect, and this last one was arson for profit when the community resisted an urban renewal proposal that came from the city of Boston that was going to develop condominiums and marinas, and the community saw that they weren't going to a part of that vision. If urban renewal, and that really was sort of the pattern, right? Gentrification and displacement. We're going to build up the community, and as they said in one of the hearings, where do we go from here? So that's what the neighborhood looked like. The black are all the, it turned out the arson for profit, trying to minimize their losses, the slumlords and the owners of the derelict land basically burned the property. They burned the property, created vacant land so they could collect insurance. And they said, at least we'll minimize our losses. This neighborhood, 50 some odd acres, was reduced to 1,400 vacant lots. And the community was still living there. They got together, they came up with a neighborhood revitalization plan that was based on their vision, not the city's vision. They had a plan, but they didn't have the land. Here's that guy again, Mel King, first black to run for mayor of Boston. He ran against Ray Flynn, and he lost to Ray Flynn. Now, Ray Flynn, and this was right in the height of court-ordered busing. Ray Flynn supported busing. He was not very popular with the African-American communities or communities of color, and so he felt he had to regain their support. And so there was a meeting at Dudley Street neighborhood. The mayor came and said, you've got to clean up, you've got to rebuild your neighborhood. You tell me what you need. Anything you need, I will provide. And he said, do you need rakes? Do you need plastic bags? Do you need, tell me what it is. On the advice of lawyers, the representatives from the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative said, we want the power of eminent domain over all abandoned land in our community. Power of eminent domain, and that never been done before. Mostly when you think about eminent domain, that's what developers use, right, to run people out of their communities, to put the throughway right through the center of town. But this community said we have to somehow gain and control over this land in our community. Ray Flynn was strapped, and he and the BRA director Stephen Cole, they agreed to do it. My sense is they maybe agreed to do it because they felt that if they agreed to do it and the community failed, they could say, well, we gave them everything. We even gave them the land, but they couldn't do it. So This is what happened. This is what that, again, that map of the abandoned land, and this is what happened when they were given the power of eminent domain, turned it into a community land trust, and rebuilt the community in the vision that they had created, and it's become now a vibrant urban village. Land and home ownership has increased. There's only been, I think, 2 defaults in the community since they did this. They provide them with kind of support of what it means to be a home owner, and it is a model of revitalization, but it requires control of land. That is probably one of the most difficult things for anyone to give up, whether it's an individual or whether it's a city. By the way, this building down here, you know what that, anybody, that's the City of Boston's governor's mansion. It's called the Shirley Eustis House. In any other part of this country, that would be a tourist attraction. And it would be refurbished, rebuilt up, but it happens to be in Roxbury, Dorchester. And so almost no one knows that there is a governor's mansion in our community. So here it is, how one, I'm going to be at odds with the name that says stop how one neighborhood stopped gentrification in its tracks. The goal was not to stop gentrification. The goal was to say, could we decouple displacement and gentrification? Can we raise the quality of life, standard of living in our communities without forcing people, without it becoming subject to speculators coming in and forcing people out? And I don't know if I have this as a slide. The way that this happened, and it's very interesting because it was the land was placed in trust, community land trust. And by the way, there were some residents who really opposed that. They did not want, what do you mean I don't own the land? Well, you have a 99-year lease. They kind of felt that that is not the same thing. And you can understand, I mean, you really can understand. So they felt that that was a concession. But here comes a second concession that they had to make in order to control speculation. They put a limit on the resale value of their properties for an extended period of time, a little longer than they would have to if they got the loan from a financial institution or a bank. And what that was able to do was to ward away speculators. They weren't willing to wait that long to be able to, but it also meant, when you think about it, and it did work, but it meant here are the poorest people in the city trying to come up with the first steps of building their wealth, but the only way they can do it is to limit how much they can make on the properties. So it's, again, a bit of a conundrum. I will say one of the most important things we did there too was to start our urban agriculture program. This is an old garage that was torn down and turned into the Dudley greenhouse. And for me, it was sort of a vindication of, like, can we transfer the New Alchemy experience to the city? So I'm going to hop really right through here, talk about renewable energy, if I can, the existential threat that's before us. And we know that how are we going to sort of deal with that? And what are our options and our causes for cautious optimism, particularly as it relates to spontaneous cooperation? Bill Hieronymus, University of Massachusetts, first a nuclear engineer, then became a wind engineer, was the first person, I think, in the country to identify the vast untapped resources off the coast of New England, offshore. And offshore wind, he says, has to be where we go. I know this is going to rankle some people, but here's Jim Gordon, the developer for Cape Wind. And I'm bringing this up only because when he came into our office, I was at the Renewable Energy Trust. I was the first director of the Renewable Energy Trust Fund. The Arthur D. Little study that I showed on the screen that talked about the options for renewable energy didn't even include offshore wind. They were not comprehensive, nor were they anticipatory about the opportunity for offshore wind. So Jim Gordon had produced all of the cleanest operating power plants in New England. They were combined cycle natural gas. He came into our office because we have this fund, Renewable Energy Trust, when the electric utility industry was restructured, opened up to competition. And part of that reason for opening up to competition was to make way for renewable energy to catch up, right, with the fossil fuel sources. We had about $25 million a year, and that came from a systems benefit charge, if you like what we did, or a tax, if you didn't like what we did, on your electric bill, right? But a small surcharge. And he said, so you're incentivizing renewable energy, I'm a independent power producer. I produce large quantities of energy, and I've looked at all the options in Massachusetts. And it's not wind, it's not solar, not for the large, right? Not for large plants that are going to replace coal. And in this case, it's still in Massachusetts, there was some oil, but mostly coal and eventually natural gas. And so he said, so I realized that the real option is offshore wind. And here's the kicker. So he then looked at us, all of us around the Massachusetts Renewable Energy Trust, and he said, tell me what I have to do. And there was we didn't know. There was nothing in place in the United States to accommodate someone who wanted to build an offshore wind farm, even though we should have anticipated it if we just cast our eyes across the pond and saw what was going on in the UK and in Denmark and in Germany, and sort of seeing that that's the future, but we couldn't do it. And matter of fact, we weren't able to do and move on things until you changed the energy bill, for which included, again, the Minerals Management Service, the folks, I think, what are they called now? The Department of Interior did permit offshore oil and gas rigs, right? They permitted offshore energy facilities. But the legislation said offshore oil and gas. It didn't say when. And you couldn't, that's sort of one of the restrictions when you deal with, obviously, government and policy. You couldn't do it because when wasn't specified. So we walked this tightrope between politicians, environmentalists, and fishermen trying to figure out what role we could play. We're the Renewable Energy Trust Fund. We're the funding renewable energy, promoting renewable energy in the state, yet we're bystanders because Governor Romney didn't support it. We had a senator who didn't support it. And what do we do? So we just tried to get information to the public so that they could make informed decisions and move from there. But again, it's very, as you all know, it was the most visceral and most just angst-filled projects that I've ever been involved with. And eventually, by the way, this is what it would take. This is an actual diagram. And if you put it up on CMAP, you can actually identify each one of the agencies, organizations that you had to deal with, but it still couldn't get you a permit. Here's a kicker. I went on a mission with Governor Deval Patrick to China. We were invited. I was invited along with Dennis Duffy, who worked for Cape Wind, and they asked us, of all things, if we would put on a workshop on offshore wind. And at that point in time, they had no offshore wind projects in the water. Of course, we didn't either. We're still trying to get one done. Today, China is the fastest growing offshore wind country in the world. And we have one pilot project in the water. And I think by all odds, people realize that offshore wind is one of the most critical pieces of our renewable energy puzzle moving forward. So, but anyway, we're focused now on the next generation of kids and educating them about renewable energy generation. And I should say real quick, working with a group in Southside Chicago, Black community on Lake Michigan, where we're looking at offshore wind in the Great Lakes. It's not a brand new idea, but it is one that sort of lost favor after a while because of the difficulties dealing with freezing water and Chicago, Lake Michigan rises and it falls. It's a very dynamic piece, but we've been asked to come and help them talk about how the community can gain benefits from the construction of offshore wind in the Great Lakes. I'm a little, obviously, upset because it's not Lake Erie and Cleveland, but it's the next best thing. So we're going to move with them. Currently, as I close out here, working with the Schumacher Center, as I mentioned before, for New Economics. Small is Beautiful, written by E.F. Schumacher, is going to be celebrating its 50th anniversary next year. Makes you feel old, doesn't it? Really getting up there. But we do have an extensive library from scholars from around the world working in alternative economics, do lectures and programs, community land trust, local currencies, reinventing the commons. And the project that I'm working on right now, and closing out, is the World Game, Buckminster Fuller's World Game. He came up with this concept. It's a simulation, global simulation, and he offered it and developed a number of years ago as a counterpoint to war games. And he said military colleges play, we all probably know this, play war games, and what they do is they have access to the current most important information around the world dealing with global human needs and trends, technologies that will achieve the goals of meeting those human needs and trends, and the resources that will be required in order to support those technologies, along with geopolitics. But then they strategically try to figure out how to literally either dominate or wipe each other off the face of the earth. The World Game says, what if you and I could play this, do our scenarios, had access to that same information, up to date, up to the minute, but the goal was to, remember that naive comment way back at the beginning, make the world work for 100% of humanity in the shortest period of time through spontaneous cooperation. Well, play the World Game. We've done it with kids. This is, again, just sort of going through the whole resource inventory, human needs and trends, technology, world resources, and they all interact. And we're finding that out right now, right, as we talk about how we're going to promote increased production of renewable energy technologies. And when someone says, as I've heard some great speakers say, when we get off oil and gas and coal, there will be no more drilling and extraction. That's not true. There's probably you still got to build the wind turbines and the solar panels, and it's not just the rare earth. It's copper, it's lead. There's a lot of mining that has to be done that gets worse if every country goes it alone. And so one of the things that we're looking at with the World Grid project was a project under the World Game. What if we resurrect the idea that Fuller came up with back in the 1970s and now has been adopted by other countries to build an interconnected world grid? The idea being that that grid would allow for 100% renewable energy because you could take advantage, especially with current ability to transmit over long distances. When he first proposed this way back when, I think I've got this. By the way, the other thing that this is tied to, and I don't know that very many people understand the movement underway, I mean, you probably know this, but to electrify the economies. Everything's going to be electrified. And that's to sort of accommodate the new renewable energy systems that are there. And I put that, just remember back in the 60s and 70s when Amory Lovins, who was then sort of the energy guru, said, you know, heating your home with electricity is like cutting butter with a chainsaw, but we're going to be heating our homes, cooking our food, driving our vehicles, and it's going to be electricity. Almost everything, except right now, at least most people think in terms of large-scale manufacturing, because we haven't quite figured that out, but I think that'll happen soon, it's going to come through the socket. And so it's a very, and someone, as my son said to me, Pops, who decided that? What, did anybody, nobody consulted me that we're just all of a sudden going to go electric, but it is one of the consequences of going 100% renewable. Fuller proposed this in the 1970s. He asked Pierre Trudeau, Premier of Canada, to share the idea with Leonid Brezhnev in Russia. The reason he wanted him to share with Russia because the weak link in this was the inability to transmit across the Bering Strait, which is about 1,500 miles. But Fuller anticipated that would be overcome soon with high voltage direct current transmission capability. And he was, in fact, right. The country that has, not the United States, that has adopted the notion of the world grid is China. They call it the global energy interconnection. Well, two countries, actually. One is India. They call it one sun, one world, one grid. But the very serious concept in terms of research and technical papers and analysis is China, who, and I'm going to end here right away, but sees this as part of their becoming the leaders in energy around the world. And they anticipated long ago that it would be renewable energy, which is why they put so much emphasis on developing their electric vehicles and charging stations, realizing that the real key to make all this work is to become more and more reliant on renewables was to crack into the transportation sector. This shows two sort of backbones. One is a polar wind backbone. The other is a equatorial solar backbone. I'm going to end with the good news. Most people said, dare to be naive, this can't happen. It's just too big of a deal. No one can who can take control, who can manage such an incredibly vast and complex project. Well, it turns out there are a bunch of worldwide examples of spontaneous cooperation. And that is, countries are either planning or have already developed what are called cross-border electric grid integrations. And they're realizing that if they cooperate and integrate their grids with other countries, what they're able to do is take advantage of the variability of solar. We know, right? That was the big challenge of doing 100% renewable energy, is that the sun doesn't always shine locally, nor does the wind always flow locally, but the wind is always flowing somewhere and the sun is always shining somewhere. Are they close enough that our existing technologies can bridge them both technically and economically? And the answer actually today is yes. And a number of studies, including Nature magazine recently saying that transcontinental interconnection will reduce carbon emissions by 10% and reduce electric costs 14 to 15%, and at the same time, eliminate the need to have standby backup systems or storage. And so resource reduction, and it is what most folks are understanding is probably going to be a very big part of the future of renewable energy in the world, and that's where I'll end.
I think we might need to give Greg another hour. Do you think he needs at least another hour? There's so many topics. Thank you very much. Yes. And you've already thanked by applause. I appreciate it. We'll use a few minutes that we have left to take some questions from the audience. You want to go? Okay. I'll go up here. I see a hand already.
You didn't believe all that. Come on, questions.
Here's the podium, Mike. Dr. Watson, thank you very much. If I was an Inuit, I would buy ice from you.
Say it again?
I would buy ice from you if I was an Eskimo.
I thought you said Iceland, but I could say that too, right?
Well, I think that I had never considered this before about, cross-world power connections, but could you speak for a minute about the political impediments to that? Yep.
And it's interesting, a German think tank has come up with a study, and it's on the geopolitics of interconnections and the grid. And here's what they're saying is that because political powers are not going to be determined now by the fact that you sit on deposits of natural gas or oil or coal. But energy is going to become in the forefront. What is going to be the source of power? And what this study says, it's the grid. Who controls the nodes of the grid? Who wills? Because it's still going to be connected. And they go so far as to say that Václav Smil, in his book, pretentiously entitled The Way the World Really Works, but he does point out that energy is the only real universal currency. I mean, everything runs on energy, and Fuller and Schumacher also predicted that at some point there would be a world currency that would be based on the kilowatt hour. So you've got that sort of as part of the equation, but the geopolitics, and then this German study says that the grid is the new script. It is going to be how people are what they're going to value, and so there's a jockeying right now. And so that some countries who were formerly on the periphery are now, because of just the logistics of interlinking various countries, are going to find themselves closer to the center. And so the answer to your question is, I don't think anybody quite knows yet, but there are conscious decisions. And one quick example, England, in terms of pulling itself out of its dependency on Russian natural gas, is proposing an offshore supergrid, right, in the sea, and they've determined that a link from Greenland to Iceland to Europe puts them in this incredible position where they're halfway between Eurasia and the United States, and that they could practice arbitrage. That is, half the time they can buy low and sell high, and then in the other part, when in sun's in the other part of the world, they can buy low from there and sell high. So there is a project you can look at, it's called Ice Link. And they're talking about the cabling and the cost and logistics of doing that. But you're not going to, this is one of the things you're not going to read about everywhere because folks are kind of just figuring out how do I strategically position myself. I think the geopolitics is still going to be very complex, but it's honestly, and I mean this, it's all the more reason. One of our projects or at least the project that we're working on at the Schumacher Center, since we've looked and tried to see and did literature search, is still doing it, looking at what's going on in China, who's monitoring this? And who's just taking a look and saying, what kind of relationships are being established between those countries? Are they bilateral? And by the way, are they purely transactional or are they truly integrated grids? Texas did not want to integrate its grid with others because it didn't want to lose its sovereignty over, you know what I'm saying, over its energy decisions. And as a result, hundreds of people died. Right? They didn't even want to do. So everyone even knows the United States has got to do the same thing. I'm too long-winded because but the geopolitics is evolving as we speak. And it's Greg, not Doctor.
I find your ending the talk with these particular slides very insightful. It is exciting, as the other questioner commented about this cross-border transnational transmission of electricity. But the problem for me is we're not seeing any spontaneous collaboration. We're seeing the major producers and future producers of power, electrical power, doubling down on oil and gas. China is gobbling up, as a 10-year retired petroleum geologist, they'll burn coal to make electricity. They'll burn oil. They'll burn gas. India's doing the same. Brazil's doing the same.
Norway's doing the same.
And Norway is doing the same. Exactly right. So small countries with big resources to large countries with big resource bases. Not big enough resource bases, they'll buy everything they can find in the market. And that's what we've got with China right now, and it's continuing. So I don't see how it really helps. It's great that we can all be plugged in, but I don't see any of the spontaneous collaboration when two in particular right now. And the German problem, Russia just shuts off their natural gas. It's not, and China and India just say, hey, we'll take Russia's cheap gas. We don't care if you take over Ukraine, evidently. I'm not hopeful about it, but this is exciting.
Yeah, and here's my point. Again, as I pointed out at the beginning, optimism stems from at least knowing that we have these options. And here's the point. See, I would disagree. I agree with you entirely about business as usual. That's really what you were describing, right? Among many of these countries. But that does not negate, and I didn't have time to include some slides that demonstrate where the actual the cross-border projects have been completed, and they are happening. Now it almost, as you're saying, I understand what you're saying is, so they're doing that, but if we're still burning, if that doesn't lead to a reduction in the burning of oil and greenhouse gas emissions, what's the point? And two things I guess I would say is, at least it's establishing the foundation. And so maybe the question I would throw back, not just to you, but to everybody, is that certainly there'll be no pushback if people don't know that this option exists, right? Why would you even do it? So part of our strategy, and it really is a little bit like sort of blowing against the wind, because we're a small little organization out there. And well, actually, I'm in Falmouth, but we were connected Great Barrington. But I was shocked at how few people understand that this is really a viable option. And maybe, and this is not I really do mean it's not a slam, but we got a lot of organizations that are protesting and are basically saying, stop. Remember what Fuller said, the best way to address a problem is not by complaining or trying to say what's wrong with the existing system, but to create the system that makes the current one obsolete. And so even if we can get people to envision that there is a system that can work, Europe has had a single market, decentralized, interconnected grid since actually before the end of World War II, right? The Marshall Plan built an integrated grid for them. And the interesting thing is it operates without any country losing its sovereignty, and it isn't controlled or managed, it's facilitated. Now, up until now is it was an interconnected grid that connected energy that was generated from fossil fuels or natural gas, but it still exists. And if you read the original documents of the visionaries who came up with this, they saw two things. They saw this and actually transportation systems like railroads as being not only a way of sharing most economically energy, but also as a precursor. They thought it was going to be a precursor to world peace. They really did. I mean, now that again, that's daring to be naive, and I'm unabashedly going to say, yes, I understand that. But if we don't reconnect somehow physically and become and understand the dependence, then we'll never make it. So there are examples that are out there. You won't read about them anywhere. And lastly, this article points out that you take people like Henry Ford and Thomas Edison. He said those were the visionaries that weren't looking at developing mere artifacts or inventions. Edison didn't want to invent just the light bulb, and or Ford, the car, they wanted a whole system. They called them system builders, right? And so what they wanted to was build the electric utility system, right? So they could sell lots of light bulbs and lots of electric appliances, or they convinced President Eisenhower, don't invest in public transportation, invest in the interstate highway system, because I want to sell cars. I don't want people on buses, on trains. And they succeeded. And what did Edison, what was he able to do? To get the government to declare electric utilities as natural monopolies, because he could see these independent utilities were coming. So all I'm saying is it is sort of political, and in many cases, yes, it's the people with the money and the resources and the time that are playing the game to their advantage. We have us, and so the idea is there some way we can take this knowledge, and that's what we're hoping to do. We want, if we can get this going, we want online, 24 hours a day, people playing the world game. And that world game is the world grid game, and they will be able to see this and experience viscerally what could happen if we start making these connections. So anyway, you're absolutely right. And they're going to hunker down even more the more that this becomes evident. There's no question about it. Anyway, I want to keep people longer. Oh.
Time for one more back here in the top.
Hi, Greg. Judy Laster.
Judy.
I just have one quick question. So today, when I was driving down here, I heard an NPR story about the new space race is going to incorporate a huge effort to have space solar, right? So how are we thinking about, while we're still trying to solve the problems here on Earth, people are looking to space. And is anybody doing research about how we're going to incorporate those new paradigms that are going to exist once they become technologically feasible?
Thank you. Yeah, there's an article in Science magazine. It was published in 2002, and they were talking about the geoengineering efforts that what people would start to resort to in terms of being able to deal with this. And that went from seeding of clouds to taking and lifting these huge panels in outer space where they could get the sun unfettered and beam it back down. And it was deemed as one of the many examples of geoengineering that they proposed. It's sort of interesting. In that very same article is the world grid, Bucky's Dymaxion map, and there's the world grid. They considered it geoengineering. And so they basically, now, the issue that you're talking about is one that's interesting because it's NASA, I think you said, is involved, and it certainly lends itself. I'm not saying that the world grid certainly, even if it's built, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to serve the purpose of creating sort of this, what's the right way, equitable infrastructure for renewables. But one of the things that that same article did point out was that if it were in place, it would, because you're now depending on another system. And remember how fast electricity travels, it's near the speed of light, right? So when that's fed in, you actually have a system where buyers and sellers sort of establish an equilibrium. Price is transparent, and everybody knows it because you're dealing with this one source, this electricity. So you sort of have the potential for creating an equitable system. Maybe not so much certainly with the space-bound one. And my sense is, I don't know what the figures would be, but I suspect that the cost would be not probably competitive even with the world grid. But it's worth monitoring, taking a look at. There's going to be other proposals as well. And but it's an indication. It's an indication that the energy transition is underway. Absolutely.
We may have to have part 2 from Greg Watson, but please join me in thanking Greg Watson for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.